यही है वो जगह, कलकत्ता, जहां से अंग्रेजों ने भारत में पहला कदम रखा। तारीख थी 31 दिसंबर सन 1600।
A class of 10-year-olds in progress, where it doesn't matter.
ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी की भी शुरुआत यही हुई थी। प्लासी का युद्ध रॉबर्ट क्लाइव ने सन 1700। स्वामीनाथन।
हाँ सर।
भारत में अंग्रेजों ने पहला कदम कहां रखा?
मालगुडी सर।
शांत रहो, शांत रहो। बेंच पे खड़े रहो, बेंच पे खड़े रहो।
The classroom is in Malgudi. But where is Malgudi? It cannot be located geographically. It is nowhere. It is somewhere. It is everywhere. Malgudi is the child of R.K. Narayan's imagination, and it lives in the mind of the reader of Narayan's fiction. It is the backdrop, the stage on which his lovable characters come and go. Jaya Ramanathan, a journalist and avid reader, speaks enthusiastically.
R.K. Narayan, now where do I start? I think I have to go back to the time when I was perhaps about 10, 11 years old and just getting over Enid Blyton and getting into Agatha Christie and Earl Stanley Gardner and others. It was sheer joy to read him because he never expected you to run for a dictionary. In fact, one thought that very often he perhaps thought in Tamil and he wrote in English. His characters are all the run-of-the-mill people. It can be the schoolmaster, the postman, the vegetable seller, the milkman, just about anyone. Now, one thing with R.K. Narayan, he was never, ever judgmental. He gave you the characters as he saw them, as he perceived them, and it was up to you to accept them. Can you always say why you did such and such a thing at such and such a time? You can't. So same thing with Narayan's characters. They behave in a certain manner in a certain given situation. They are not to be blamed. They are human. They are all extremely human, and therefore they become extremely lovable and identifiable with.
In a recording from the archives of All India Radio, R.K. Narayan spoke of Malgudi.
My Malgudi is actually a notion. It's not a geography, but a notion which has characteristics of any group of persons living, any small society. It's not a big city where a lot of familiarity between those who live, who are very close to their own landmarks and other personages around. For instance, I meant when I said the Malgudi could be seen even in New York, I've lived in New York for several months at a time at a hotel called Chelsea on West 23rd Street, which is a very good background for an American Malgudi, because the same shopman, the same lawyer and dentist and Market Road and a little school and a YMCA, all kinds of things have been stationary there, and most persons know each other there in that street. Yes. So that's the kind of quality I try to present in my Malgudi. That you find anywhere in the world, and to fix it geographically is nonsense, I think.
On the 10th of October 2006, R.K. Narayan would have scored a century, except that he was run out about 5 years short. His body of work, 15 novels set in the fictional town of Malgudi, 5 collections of short stories, 3 titles of legends retold, a memoir, My Days, travel writings, and 4 volumes of essays written over a period of 7 decades, continues to attract readers and, increasingly, the attention of intellectuals, academics and researchers. In Mysore, his hometown, a conference was held beginning on the 10th of October 2006 to deliberate on what makes him one of the best Indian writers of fiction in English in the 20th century. Graham Greene, the celebrated novelist, was responsible for launching the very successful writing career of R.K. Narayan, whose first novel, Swami and Friends, was published in England in 1935. Yet, Greene had some anxieties which he expressed to Narayan in a letter dated 1st August 1935. I quote, 50,000 words is awkwardly short, and he asked tactfully, have you any objection to a few alterations in the English? At times, the grammar and sense need tightening. Charmingly illustrated by the author's brother, the equally renowned R.K. Lakshman, the book was a resounding success. A book in 10,000, said Graham Greene. Mr. N.K. Bhattacharya, editor of Indian Literature, the literary magazine of the Sahitya Academy, which co-sponsored the conference in Mysore, identifies why.
He invests a kind of mythical aura on the realistic details. And that is how, book after book, the interest in the same apparently repetitive or allegedly unchanged locale remains. And then he looks at the adult world, he rather takes on the adult world from boys' angles. For example, our Swaminathan, he is working on an arithmetical problem. You have 4 annas or 6 annas, you have to buy some mangoes, and so, how do you juggle your money and the number of mangoes? As we read, suddenly we find that Swaminathan cannot really comprehend that what is so much hullabaloo about whether 14 annas and 8 mangoes or 8 annas for 14 mangoes. Why are not people interested in finding out whether the mangoes are ripe and sweet or not? And he does so with all seriousness. It's not that he is quipping. So I think this kind of humor in a flash, where the boy's eye looks at the adult world and is puzzled about the stupidity within quotes of the adult people. That is where the humor of R.K. Narayan generally lies, and it is full of very gentle kind of irony. There is no viciousness anywhere, there is no sarcasm anywhere, and this humor ultimately works as a kind of balm in the mind of the people, of the readers particularly.
Incidentally, young Swami's greatest passion was the MCC, the Malgudi Cricket Club, which he founded together with his young friends in school. In a sense, Graham Greene can be considered the opening batsman in Narayan's live match. And if you are anywhere near a half-century yourself, you will surely recognize the signature tune of the popular TV serials on Swami and Friends and Malgudi Days of the late 1980s. Manjunath, a well-known child actor from the South, played Swami as a 10-year-old. He recalls his first meeting with Narayan.
I really didn't know that he was such a big writer. I was just 10 years old at that time. But initially I mistook him for R.K. Lakshman because I used to love his cartoons. Okay. So the first time I met him, I said, can you make me a cartoon? So he said, no, that's not me, that's my brother. I felt really embarrassed now. But the greatest moment or the funnest moment I had was after the success of Swami and his Friends. I met him at a party organized to celebrate it. And there he met me and he kind of patted me on my back and said, you're exactly how I envisaged Swami to be. It didn't strike to me at that time. I just said thanks, and subsequently I've done my BA in English Literature, Economics and Sociology. So being a literature student, I really realized what that meant, and I think that outdid all my awards. Swami is a character that any kid in India would recognize.
Chami, कहाँ चला? क्रिकेट प्रैक्टिस, कल टेस्ट मैच है ना, MCC वर्सेस बोर्ड हाई स्कूल. अच्छा, तू किस तरफ से खेलेगा? कितनी बार कहा तुमसे? मैं MCC यानी मालगुडी क्रिकेट क्लब का वाइस कैप्टन हूँ और ओपनिंग बॉलर भी. टीम वाले मुझे टेट कहकर बुलाते हैं. टेट? हाँ, बहुत बड़ा अंग्रेज बॉलर है वो. तो आज स्कूल नहीं जाओगे? जाऊंगा प्रैक्टिस के बाद. नाश्ता करके जाना. आज देर हो गई. जामिए, सारा दिन दौड़ता फिरता रहता है रे तू. इतनी ताकत कहाँ से आती है रे तुझ में? रोज बादाम का हलवा खिलाती हो ना तुम, वहीं से आती है ताकत.
Urvashi Butalia, publisher and author herself, recalls the excitement that serial generated.
I thoroughly enjoyed it, looked forward to it. One of the few serials that I actually waited for and watched. It was completely enjoyable. It wasn't certainly it was a cut and a class above pretty much all the serials that are on television these days.
To ensure that his work would be accessible to the average person in India, R.K. Narayan had taken a shrewd business decision in 1942 to set up his own publishing house. By 1942, he had recovered from the deep despondency which the death of his young wife in 1939 had plunged him, which he speaks of in his autobiographical work, My Days, and which his biographers N. Ram and Susan Ram have documented in detail. Mr. N. Ram, editor of The Hindu, recounts the genesis of the publishing house.
He went through two great personal blows, the death of his wife in 1939 and the death of his only child, his daughter Hema, in 1994. He was resilient, and out of this tragedies came great literature, particularly after the first. The publishing house he founded called Indian Thought in 1942, where the only author that publisher publishes is himself. He started it to keep prices low, because many of these books are first published in the UK and some in the US, and the prices were too high for the Indian market. But Narayan, since he didn't have to pay royalties to himself, he just kept the price very low, maybe 25 rupees, 50 or 40, and he had an agreement with the press. It was all the editing was done in the UK. It was a beautiful arrangement, and he would just he had the rights. He would have it printed and just write to the press, send so many copies to India Book House or whatever, and they would send it. And they were very honest. He was very happy with this relationship.
R.K. Narayan had risen from the ashes of near extinction and personal angst so soon after his debut novel of 1935, and reaffirmed his determination to be a full-time writer. Ruskin Bond, a successful writer himself, cast in a similar mould, modest and determined, but a generation removed, discovered Narayan in adulthood. On being asked if R.K. Narayan attracts the reader of today, he remarked,
"Reading trends and fashions do change over the years, and sometimes the authors we grow up with might go out of fashion, and others might last longer. I think Narayan does have an abiding place in English writing in India because he was a pathfinder. He wrote about ordinary people from all walks of life. He didn't have sort of elitist characters or heroes. He wrote about small-town life, now which is rare. Many writers in the Indian English line are inclined to be maybe big city writers. And his humanitarian qualities, I think, also, would help to give him a lasting place. Plus, he writes simply, so the language doesn't go out of fashion or doesn't seem archaic. And he tells a good story. After all, it's storytelling that counts in the long run.
When R.K. Narayan's eighth novel, The Guide, which had won the Sahitya Akademi Award in 1958 and was turned into a very successful film in 1965, starring Dev Anand and Wahida Rahman, Narayan was catapulted into the national consciousness, even though he was reportedly unhappy about the many changes in the film's script. Anjali Gera Roy, who teaches a special course on fiction and film appreciation at the IIT Kharagpur, speaks of both the book as well as the film Guide.
The novel is immensely cinematic. It would have been very easy for a filmmaker to film this novel because R.K. Narayan's imagination is so visual. He provides such a wealth of detail to the filmmaker. I'm not surprised why Devanand chose to film this novel. Devanand's Guides, an immensely successful film, but it varied in the details. The setting has moved to Udaipur. Now, Udaipur is not Malgudi, but then when I look at it from the filmmaker's point of view, because film is a very commercial proposition, Malgudi in the 60s would not have been a very smart Hindi film formula. You need a more recognizably tourist place like Udaipur to make an appeal. If you look at them as two independent texts, I think we'd be able to appreciate both, because the Guide has made such an impact on Hindi cinema. When I was watching Fana, I thought there was Amir Khan doing Devanand, because you can't think of Guide without Devanand. You can't think of Guide without Wahida Rahman. And when you're watching Fana, you have echoes of even the muffler he wears and the way he speaks, that glib talking, fast talking, the shairi, and the relationship also, the rescue motive. And you're immediately reminded of Guide, the film. So you think that as much as the novel The Guide is a classic, the film Guide also has become a classic, a milestone in Hindi cinema of that kind.
लाख मना ले दुनिया साथ ना ये छूटेगा आके मेरे हाथों में हाथ ना ये छूटेगा ओ मेरे जीवन साथी तेरे मेरे सपने अब एक रंग है.
Did the popularity of the film, with its wonderful music and elaborate dance sequences, for an absolutely luscious Rosie, as played by Wahida Rahman, translate into speeded-up sales of the book? Perhaps, perhaps not. The question then is whether the TV serial and the film helped to confer the near-classic status R.K. Narayan seems to have achieved in the 21st century. Maybe help is at hand from the intelligentsia and scholars. Harish Trivedi, Professor of English at Delhi University and Chairperson of the Indian Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies, outlines plans for a revival besides a tribute.
Narayan lived in Mysore for most of his writing life. Though he wasn't born there, he was born in Chennai, and he died in Chennai as well, having gone back there. But Mysore is obviously as much Malgudi as any other place. And I heard that they would want a road named after him or a train named after him or something like that, which would be a kind of civic reminder of his presence there. At the conference, I suggested that we could perhaps think of setting up an R.K. Narayan research center, which would gather together in one place a lot of important archival material, which right now is spread throughout the world. Narayan sold his own papers to a university in Boston. To study R.K. Narayan archivally, one has to go to Boston and spend some time there. And I think one thing that we can do is to set up a well-endowed research center for the study initially of Narayan, but as it grows, perhaps of other contemporary writers in English, so that is little danger that has come about recently of Narayan and Mulkaraj Anand and Raja Rao, the early founding figures of Indian fiction in English, are not eclipsed entirely by the newer diasporic cosmopolitan generation of Rushdie and Vikram Seth and Amitabh Ghosh and Jhumpa Lahiri and now Kiran Desai. Actually, when Kiran Desai got the Booker Award, I was delighted that there was at least one newspaper which, in an editorial, said that The Inheritance of Loss, being the title of Kiran Desai's novel, it said, the inheritance of Kiran Desai very much includes R.K. Narayan.
This revival is necessary since the current trend of courting glamour and active promotion works against the classics. For example, at the Frankfurt Book Fair in October 2006, at which India was the guest of honor, R.K. Narayan was conspicuous by his non-representation. Urvashi Batalia was there.
It's interesting to me as a publisher that things that are classics do not get either promoted or do not endure in the same way. And I think part of the reason is that Narayan is no longer around. So, in a sense, his work is kind of pushed out, dismissed, because in the current atmosphere of publishing, what is needed is to have a young, attractive writer who can promote the work. So the old writers whose work is enduring and who are classics don't easily get pushed into translations in other languages because he hasn't been translated that much. So I find it very interesting that he wasn't there, because to my mind, his characters would be eminently translatable and eminently travelable. They are the kind of characters that travel. They're culturally specific, but they have a universality to them.
Professor Harish Trivedi indicated new areas of research.
There was an American critic who related Narayan's work to European modernism in totally startling and insightful ways. And there was an Indian critic who read The World of Nagaraj, which many consider the last major novel by R.K. Narayan, in fact, as a postmodernist metatext. And both these readings I thought were extremely persuasive. There were other papers which highlighted what Narayan himself considered to be his proto-feminism in a novel as early as The Dark Room in the early 1940s, where he shows the domestic marital exploitation of women by uncaring or unfaithful husbands. And there was, I think, a very acute paper on what may be an unsuspected kind of topic in the context of Narayan called Sexuality and R.K. Narayan. So there were a number of new approaches. And I thought once one got over the initial shock that Narayan could take these readings, we were all very enlightened.
Mridula Garg, an eminent Hindi novelist herself, spoke of the elements which will make him endure.
I read R.K. Narayan in more or less the same way I read Mupasa or Graham Greene. That is, as a storyteller. And I feel the hallmark of a great storyteller is that he respects his readers as much as he expects his readers to respect him. That is, he doesn't philosophize, he doesn't pontificate, he doesn't preach, he doesn't hand you conclusions. He lets the reader decide for himself. And that requires a great art, is because simplicity is probably the most difficult art to master. And that was the art that R.K. Narayan had mastered. Hindi writers at that time, the greatest, of course, is considered to be Premchand. And his foil, I would say, is Jainendra. But neither of them dealt in satire. The comic relief was there, but the comic sense, the tragicomic sense which R.K. Narayan had, that was not there at all. Nobody in Hindi wrote with the same kind of understatement which R.K. Narayan did. And I think even to date, that's a very rare quality, both in the writers who are writing in English and the writers who are writing in Hindi.
Judith Brown teaches English literature in the USA. She has another viewpoint.
Well, I think R.K. Narayan is always understood to be the simple writer. The irony is that he's a very complicated thinker and a complicated writer, so that all of these academics and writers can get together and really detail his works because they're so layered and they're so rich. If he were such a simple writer, I don't know that we would be all that interested in him. So I think that's the myth around R.K. Narayan, is he is very simple, but I don't agree. I think he's very complicated, in fact.
Alistair Niven, literary critic from the UK, pays handsome tribute.
He's probably still the best-known writer in Britain and in the Western world of that generation of Indian writers, but that doesn't mean that he's a household name anymore. He's not, and he deserves to be. He's a classic writer, and I think as a short story writer, he's probably up with Chekhov and the greats. I knew several of the doyens of Indian writing in English really quite well, Mulkraj Anand, Nirad Chowdhury and so on, but I hadn't had the opportunity to meet R.K. Narayan until I was visiting Chennai just a couple of years before he died. And to my delight and surprise, he invited me round to his house, and there we sat on the veranda and we simply talked. I did a lot of the talking. He was very deaf, but every time he replied or asked me a question, it was amusing. The sense of humour was so powerful. I remember, for example, we were reminiscing about Graham Greene. It wasn't Greene's eminence as a writer that he talked about. He remembered him as a ladies' man, and he wanted to know what had happened to Graham Greene's girlfriends, and we had a good chortle about it.
The real centenary celebration for R.K. Narayan would be when, please notice not if, Swami and Friends makes it, as Mr. N. Ram points out.
I learned from bookshops that he's a writer whose books are bought, it's not that this is a bestseller and that's it. It's bought throughout the year. So I think there there's a very good chance that Swami and Friends, his first novel published with the help of Graham Greene in 1935, will continue to be in print in 2035. That's the centenary Narayan would appreciate, not the centenary of his birth, which he thought just celebrating 100 years of almost an accident. So I think his work will remain in print, and today, looking back, he is the towering figure, an extremely long-lived writer of integrity, who knew what he wanted and stayed with it.
From an All India Radio archival recording, we bring you the renowned Kannada literateur U.R. Ananthamurthy in conversation with R.K. Narayan.
When I was reading your book again, I came across John Updike, who said, Narayan is one of a vanishing breed, the writer as citizen. And I think this is very aptly put. One of the best things said about as citizen. Yes. And I could see how true he is. I have a passage which I noted down because I was very moved by the passage. You say, in your old age, I am quoting you, if I have to worry, it is about things outside me, mostly not concerning me. I generally fret about municipal shortcomings. When I find the streets not properly lit, I bother the officials with telephone calls and letters. I have also taken upon myself the impossible task of protecting the thousands of trees in Mysore. And then you talk about the tree in front of your house, how it has grown taller and wider than ever, and it is a perennial concern for you. And then also you were concerned how to save the Kukanalli tank, and you have saved it. As a teacher of the university, I also loved the Kukanalli tank when I was a student. So I have many things, sir, which I share with you. So this passage very deeply moved me.
Kukanalli tank is a very inspiring place. It has some mystic quality about its sunsets and certain hours, which really help. I used to see Venkatappa, the old artist, Mysore artist, coming there every evening at 4 o'clock, seating himself on a bench and just staying there for 4 hours and going back home, talking to nobody, nothing, just watching the sunset and the surroundings and imbibing. And I think he produced quite a worthwhile canvas from that. Though modern artists may not like the realism of it, he produced very good pictures. He painted wonderful pictures.
Yes, R.K. Narayan's own canvas was small. He never attempted an epic scale. It was perfectly suited to the world he created, of the middle ground, of the common man, a world he was intimately acquainted with. His integrity and simplicity shine through, and he did not like to discuss the meaning of his work. He simply wanted the reader to be drawn in and carried away.